When the church doors flew open, no one expected it. 12 U.S. Marines, impeccably dressed, eyes locked forward, marched down the aisle in perfect formation. Guests froze. Glasses slipped from trembling hands. This wasn't part of the wedding. No one had rehearsed this. But when the lead Marine saluted the bride and revealed the identity of the old black man by her side, the entire room went dead silent. Because for 6 years, she'd been feeding a stranger, not knowing she was saving a war hero who once carried dying soldiers through enemy fire. What began as one pastry a day led to a salute seen by hundreds. Stay with us to witness the moment kindness met honor and stunned the world into silence. If you've ever believed one small act can change a life, hit like, subscribe, and keep watching. This story will move you in ways you never expected. At exactly 4:30 a.m. every weekday, Jessica Morgan unlocked the back door of Harbor Light Cafe, a small but beloved bakery nestled along the eastern edge of New Orleans' Bywater district. By the time most of the city was just stirring, Jessica was already elbow-deep in flour, orchestrating her pastry routine with the quiet grace of a seasoned artist. At 31, she had spent nearly 7 years as head baker, known by name among locals for her flaky almond croissants and golden pecan sticky buns that melted like sugar on the tongue. But those who worked with her whispered about something else entirely. Jessica had a ritual. Every morning, right after pulling the first golden tray from the oven, she would carefully wrap one fresh pastry still warm and pour a steaming cup of black coffee into a to-go cup. She didn't say a word. She would quietly slip out the rear alleyway, her apron still dusted with flour, and walk a block to the corner where St. Claude Avenue met Mazant Street. There, at a battered old bus stop bench, she would place the pastry and coffee beside a neatly folded napkin with the same handwritten message, "Wishing you a gentle morning." And there, always already waiting, was a man no one else noticed. He was an older black man, maybe in his late 60s, with deep creases lining his face and salt-and-pepper dreadlocks peeking beneath a worn beanie. He wore the same scuffed trench coat day after day, his posture upright but distant, his gaze never begging, just watching the morning unfold. He never asked for anything, never approached customers, never made a scene. But he was always there, always quiet, always alone. And for over 5 years, Jessica never once asked his name. Her co-workers found it strange, some even laughed behind her back. "She's wasting product on a stranger," one of the baristas once mumbled during a break. "He's probably just using her kindness," another smirked. But Jessica said nothing. Not because she agreed, but because explaining kindness to people who measured value in dollars felt like trying to teach a sunrise to a blindfold. 3 months earlier, the cafe changed ownership. A new manager, crisp and numbers-driven, held Jessica's annual performance review. The conversation had started off politely, but turned pointed. "Jess," he said, flipping through a spreadsheet, "I've heard a few customers mention discomfort about the man who loiters outside." Jessica met his eyes calmly. "He's not loitering. He's waiting." The manager hesitated. "It's a sweet gesture, what you're doing. But maybe it's time to redirect that energy. There are proper shelters for people like him." Jessica had nodded. Professionally, respectfully. But when the meeting ended, she simply adjusted her routine. She began arriving 15 minutes earlier, leaving the food and coffee before anyone else arrived to notice. She thought her kindness had gone back to being invisible. Until 1 week ago, a new server had caught her coming back in through the alley, wiping rain from her coat. The girl leaned into a customer and whispered just loud enough, "She's been feeding that homeless guy for years. Every single day." The customer shook her head with pity painted thick across her face. "Poor thing. Thinks she's making a difference." Jessica kept rolling dough, her hands steady as ever. But the words lodged somewhere under her ribs. Not because she was embarrassed, but because they couldn't see what she saw. Not a case, not a problem, but a man. A human being. Someone who had a name, a life, a story, whether he ever shared it or not. Her mother had warned her years ago, when Jessica first got engaged to Calvin, a local EMT who volunteered part-time with a mobile clinic. "You've always been too soft-hearted," she'd sighed. "Picking up strays, giving away what you earn." But Jessica knew something deeper than judgment. Giving isn't about applause. It's about recognition. Not of status, but of worth. She never once asked the man on the bench to tell his story. She just showed up. Pastry, coffee, napkin, every single morning. And in doing so, she had unknowingly saved more than just a morning. The rain had rolled in unusually hard that morning. New Orleans was no stranger to moody weather, but this storm had a weight to it, low, drizzling, persistent. Jessica stood by the kitchen window, watching water snake down the glass while her cinnamon rolls cooled on the rack. She glanced at the clock, 5:58 a.m. Her feet moved on instinct, her hands already wrapping a croissant and sealing a cup of coffee. This time, she added something more. Her own wool scarf, the one with the frayed edges that had survived college winters and heartaches alike. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the paper bag beside the pastry. She walked into the rain, hood pulled tight. The man was there as always, his coat visibly damp, his hands trembling ever so slightly. Jessica said nothing. She just placed the bag beside him, gave a brief nod, and turned back toward the alley. But that morning felt different. He didn't nod back. He just looked at her, really looked at her for a second longer than usual. The next day, when Jessica returned to the bench, she found a note. A square napkin folded in half, tucked beneath the paper cup like a secret. The words, written in faint, shaky pencil, read, "Thank you for seeing me as a person." She read it 3 times, then folded it gently and slid it into her wallet. From that moment on, she carried it with her everywhere. On days when the world felt cruel, when people forgot to say thank you, or when life seemed like an uphill climb, she would take it out, smooth its creases, and remember that being kind was never wasted. As her wedding day approached, Jessica was juggling frosting trials and seating charts. She'd, of course, ordered her cake from Harbor Light Cafe, despite it now being under new management. And naturally, she'd invited all her former co-workers, yes, even the ones who once whispered behind her back. Her fiancé, Calvin, teased her gently about it one night over dinner. "You sure we got enough chairs for the whole zip code?" He grinned. Jessica shrugged. "If I've shared a kitchen or a kindness with them, they're family." Calvin understood. That's what she loved most about him. He never questioned her heart. Then, 2 days before the wedding, a letter arrived. Hand-delivered. No return address. The envelope was plain, but the calligraphy on the front was formal and intentional. To the bride, Jessica Morgan. Inside was a small cream card. A short note, written in dark blue ink. "Tomorrow I will come not for cake, but to honor a debt." No signature. No explanation. Her wedding planner, a meticulous woman who tracked RSVPs like military logistics, was perplexed. Is this from one of Calvin's paramedic buddies? Jessica tilted the card in her hand, squinting at the slant of the handwriting. Something about it tugged at a corner of her memory, but she couldn't quite place it. She set the note aside. Let it be. Not everything needed explaining. Then came the wedding day. Jessica stood in the small bridal suite behind the old church on Esplanade Avenue, lace and ivory pooling around her feet like spun sugar. Through the stained glass window, she watched the early guests arrive, neighbors, co-workers, distant cousins. The air was humid, thick with the promise of celebration. Then her breath caught. Standing awkwardly near the church steps, removed from the crowd, was a familiar figure. The old black man from the bus bench. But today he wasn't wrapped in his threadbare coat. Instead, he wore a faded gray suit, carefully pressed, the lapels still bearing the ghost of better days. His worn shoes were freshly polished. His dreadlocks were pulled back neatly. And for the first time, Jessica saw his face completely lined with age and experience. Yes, but noble, dignified, alive. She barely noticed the whispers until they sliced through the church foyer like tiny blades. Who let him in here? Don't tell me she invited that homeless man. Maybe he's here for a handout. Weddings get leftovers, right? Jessica froze. Her heart clenched, but not from shame, from anger. Without a word to her bridesmaids, she gathered her train in her arms and ran, white silk fluttering behind her like a banner of rebellion. The wedding planner gasped. Photographers scrambled. Guests turned in surprise. Jessica didn't care. She reached the man in moments and wrapped her arms around him before a single, more judgmental word could be said. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered, "I still remember your eyes." The first time, in 2017. The man's lips curled into a slow, genuine smile that softened every weathered line on his face. "And I remember every morning you treated me like I mattered," he replied, his voice steadier than she had ever imagined. She took his arm in hers. Together, They turned to walk into the church. And that's when the sound of engines pulling up outside turned every head. The echo of tires crunching against the church driveway silenced the last whispers. Heads turned toward the entrance. The heavy double doors creaked open not from a breeze, but with precise coordination. 12 men stepped in. 12 United States Marines, dressed in immaculate dress blues, their boots polished to a mirror shine, their white gloves pristine. They moved in perfect formation down the church aisle, one step at a time, their cadence silent yet thunderous in its presence. Not a word was spoken. No music played. Even the buzzing chatter of the earlier murmurs had vanished, replaced by a thick air of confusion and awe. Jessica froze mid-step, still holding the arm of the elderly man beside her. One guest dropped a champagne glass, the crash ringing sharply through the sacred space. At the front of the procession stood a tall Marine with piercing eyes and a chest full of ribbons. His nameplate read, Williams. Captain Darren Williams. He stepped forward, came to a crisp halt before Jessica and the man at her side, and snapped a perfect salute. On behalf of Alpha Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, he announced, his voice resonating through the cathedral like a thunderclap of reverence. We are here to honor the woman who quietly sustained a hero for 6 years. Jessica blinked, uncertain she had heard correctly. Captain Williams turned slightly to face the man whose arm she held. This man, he said with solemn gravity, is Sergeant Elijah Grant. In 2004, during an ambush in Fallujah, he carried 9 wounded Marines out of a kill zone. He took 2 bullets to the leg and returned 8 more times under enemy fire to pull others out. That act earned him a Silver Star, which he never claimed. Mouths opened across the pews. Even those who had spoken judgment earlier now sat paralyzed by the revelation. Captain Williams paused. In 2016, Sergeant Grant lost his wife and daughter in a tragic car accident. With no family left, he disappeared from society, never used his benefits, never told a soul who he was. He lived quietly, anonymously, until today. Jessica stared at the man beside her, her fingers still looped around his arm. He was no longer just the man on the bench. He was a soldier, a father, a widower, a hero, but he had never asked to be remembered for any of that. One of the Marines stepped forward holding a shadow box, wrapped in deep blue velvet. Inside it was a medal, slightly tarnished but still gleaming, and an old photograph. The picture showed a younger Elijah Grant leaner, uniform stained with blood, carrying a Marine on his back through a ruined street. Behind him, another soldier could be seen crawling with effort, blood smeared across his pants. That soldier was Captain Williams. He carried me 4 blocks while under heavy fire, Williams explained, his voice now tight with emotion. I had shrapnel in both legs. I would have died that day. And then he went back for more. He turned toward the church guests, many now dabbing eyes with tissues. If not for him, I wouldn't be standing here. And if not for Jessica Morgan, he may not have survived to see this day. Jessica's hands trembled as she looked up at Elijah, tears streaming freely now. I didn't know, she whispered. That was the point, Elijah said, voice soft but steady. I didn't want to be thanked for doing my duty. After I lost my family, I couldn't be around people who called me a hero when I couldn't even save the ones who mattered most. He looked down, visibly swallowing the grief that hadn't aged a day. Then he continued, but you never asked who I was. You never demanded a story. You just gave me coffee, and a croissant, and notes that told me I still existed in this world. The Marines behind Williams repositioned themselves into an honor guard, lining both sides of the aisle from the entrance to the altar, their movements sharp and unified. Captain Williams turned back to the guests. Jessica Morgan didn't know she was feeding a war hero. She just saw a man who needed dignity, and she gave it without expectation, without recognition, every single day. His eyes locked on a cluster of guests near the back, those who had scoffed earlier. The weight of shame sat heavy on their expressions. In the Marine Corps, he said firmly, we live by a creed. Never leave a Marine behind. He looked directly at Jessica. You never wore a uniform, Ms. Morgan, but you understood that creed better than most of us ever could. The church was still silent, no coughs, no shifting pews, just the weight of reverence and regret hanging in the air. From the front pew, one of Jessica's bridesmaids stepped forward, her face wet with emotion. I work with her, she choked out. She paid for those pastries herself. Every day? She never told anyone. Another coworker stood, voice breaking. We used to tease her. I'm so sorry. And then, a man from the groom's side stood too. We're not just at a wedding, he said aloud. We're at a moment of truth. All eyes turned to Jessica and Elijah, standing at the threshold of something bigger than vows. Elijah turned toward Jessica, his weathered hand slowly reaching for hers. His palm was calloused, his grip gentle, unmistakably strong, yet humbly restrained. His voice dropped lower, so only she and those closest could hear. I came here today, he said, to give you the only gift I have left, my presence, my truth, and my gratitude. Jessica tried to respond, but her throat closed tight. Her tears had smudged her makeup long ago, but she didn't care. This moment, unexpected and raw, felt far more sacred than anything she had written in her wedding vows. Elijah continued, his voice still steady. I knew you were getting married. I overheard you telling that little girl at the cafe counter, the one who always ordered chocolate milk. I thought maybe I'd leave a note, maybe slip in and watch from the street. But I wanted you to know what you did mattered, that the smallest act gave me the strength to keep breathing. Jessica gave a soft laugh through her tears. This is the most beautiful wedding gift I've ever received. Just then, Calvin, the groom dressed in his tailored navy blue suit and a fireman's pin over his heart, stepped forward from the altar. He'd been standing quietly for several minutes, watching the moment unfold, not with jealousy or impatience, but with awe. He approached slowly, extending his hand toward Elijah. Sir, Calvin said with quiet honor, it would mean the world to me if you would walk Jessica down the aisle. A hush fell again. Elijah looked stunned. His eyes glistened with a kind of emotion too deep to label pride, disbelief, maybe even healing. He nodded, silently. The organist, confused but responsive, began to play again, soft, reverent chords filling the air. And so, Sergeant Elijah Grant, a man once left behind by society, now stepped forward as a symbol of dignity reclaimed. On either side of the aisle, the 12 Marines stood like pillars of honor, forming a path that stretched to the altar. Jessica looped her arm through Elijah's again. Together, they walked forward. Some guests wept openly. Others stood in silent reverence, heads bowed as if watching something more than a ceremony, something holy. This was no longer just a wedding. It was an act of restoration. After the ceremony, while laughter filled the reception and music played outside beneath strings of glowing cafe lights, Jessica and Calvin made a quiet decision. They didn't want a honeymoon in the Bahamas. Not now. Not after this. Instead, they used the money from their wedding gifts to start something small but powerful, the quiet table. It began as a simple breakfast stand outside Harbor Light Cafe, only this time, with Jessica's full blessing. Calvin, on his days off, helped pour coffee. Volunteers from the community rotated shifts. Veterans were fed with no questions, no forms, no bureaucracy. Just eggs, toast, and dignity. There were no press releases, no hashtags, no photo ops, just a sign carved from old barn wood with 5 simple words. Feeding one life sustains many. Elijah Grant never returned to the quiet table. Not in person, but once a month, Jessica received a postcard from somewhere: New Sacramento, Denver, Mobile, Detroit. On the back of each card was a different landmark, and the same exact phrase in Elijah's spidery handwriting. Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Jessica. One afternoon, while cleaning up the table, Jessica noticed a man standing nearby, a young veteran with tired eyes, holding a backpack and not quite sure how to ask for food. Jessica smiled and simply handed him a plate. Captain Williams, now out of uniform, in civilian clothes, approached a moment later, carrying a flower. He placed it next to the donation jar, where Elijah's original napkin note sat framed. Thank you for seeing me as a person. Williams looked at Jessica and nodded. We'll take shifts here. Me and the guys. This isn't an honor we're willing to let fade. Jessica didn't need applause. But that day, as the sun set over New Orleans and the smell of pancakes mixed with jasmine in the breeze, she finally understood something Elijah had once said, that not every hero wears medals, and not every medal needs a chest to shine on. Sometimes, the brightest honors are in the quietest gestures. The quiet table had no walls, no register, no business hours. But it became a sanctuary. Veterans from across New Orleans began to find their way there, some on foot, some guided by word of mouth, others drawn by the scent of fresh grits and cornbread in the air. They came for a hot meal, but they stayed because no one asked them for their past. No one tried to fix them or define them. There was only one rule: sit, eat, be seen. Jessica framed Elijah's first note, "Thank you for seeing me as a person," above the makeshift counter. But beneath it, she added a second message in her own neat cursive. "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." 6 months after the wedding, a local news crew caught wind of the quiet table. A producer called to request an on-camera interview. Jessica politely declined. "If you want a story," she said, "talk to the people who sit here. This isn't about me." Instead of putting herself on screen, she handed the reporter a list of veterans who might want to share their journey on their terms. And many did. Stories emerged of former medics, artillery officers, cooks, translators, some black, some white, some Latino, all united by a thread society had once snipped. They had all been forgotten. Some days were hard. Volunteers didn't always show. Supplies ran low. The Louisiana heat was relentless, and the city's bureaucracy didn't make things easy. But when Jessica felt exhausted, she would close her eyes and return to that moment in the church, the 12 Marines, standing at attention, saluting her not for fame or patriotism, but for a simple, silent kindness. That memory carried her through. Calvin understood, deeply. As a firefighter, he knew that not all heroism involved running into burning buildings. Some of it involved simply showing up consistently, quietly, without anyone clapping for you. One evening, after they had wiped down the last folding table and packed the leftover bread, Calvin turned to Jessica and said, "You know, when I married you, I thought I was getting a wife. But it turns out, I got 12 Marines, a bench full of warriors, and a whole community of second chances." Jessica smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "The best kind of family," she said. "The kind you choose. The kind that chooses you back." By the first anniversary of their wedding, the quiet table had become more than just a local effort. It had grown into a movement. Veterans across the city started hosting their own versions: quiet corners, front porch Fridays, sidewalk suppers. The idea was always the same: feed one person with dignity, and you might save their life. On that anniversary morning, as Jessica and Calvin walked toward their humble serving station, they noticed 12 men standing there waiting. But they weren't in uniform this time. They wore jeans and polos, ball caps and sneakers. Each Marine held a single flower. Captain Darren Williams stepped forward and gently placed a white lily in the center of the table. "We'll be taking shifts volunteering here," he said. "It's our way of saying this legacy won't fade." Jessica didn't cry, not this time. She just nodded, heart full. And that's how it continued. Every month, a new postcard would arrive from Elijah Grant. Sometimes it came from Colorado, sometimes from Texas, once from a tiny town in Vermont. The back always had the same message: "Every breakfast is a salute. Thank you, Jessica." Captain Williams had told them that Elijah was now finally receiving the care he deserved. The VA had helped him get medical support. He was in trauma counseling. He had a roof, a community, and most importantly, a reason to reconnect. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. And so were the people Jessica fed. You see, not all wounds bleed. Not all veterans carry visible scars. Some carry the silence of being unseen, of waking up every day and not being looked at. Not really. That's what Jessica had healed. Not with money, not with programs, but with a croissant, a cup of coffee, and a note that said, "You exist." On especially rough mornings, when the eggs burned or the griddle sputtered, Jessica would glance at the napkin framed above the counter. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." And underneath, "Everyone who sits at this table has a story worth knowing." She'd take a deep breath, crack open a fresh carton of eggs, and start again. Because some debts don't require money, only acknowledgement. Some heroes never ask to be saluted, but they deserve it anyway. And some legacies begin not with applause, but with a woman who refuses to look away.